let's look at some of our safety precautions and then some social awareness of cannabis use. First, we'll start out with some cannabis myths, because there's quite a few out there, but I'm only going to cover just a few of them. And these myths have persisted, and a lot of that is due to some propaganda, but there's also some myths that are circulating that are actually a little bit dangerous. First one is cannabis is a cure-all. Absolutely not. Cannabis is great for so many things, but it's not a cure-all. It's just another tool in the medical tool bag to help us manage life, right? It's just a tool to help us get through life, manage some of our symptoms, help us to maybe get along with people, a little bit of a social lubricant, but it's not a cure-all. But how great is it that we do have that tool in our tool bag? Cannabis cures cancer. Sometimes. So you go on Facebook or other social media and you'll see no end of memes that saying, you know, cancer can be cured by cannabis. It's all that you need. And yes, absolutely. Cancer has really helped a lot of people with their with their cancer diagnosis. It's also helped for people to manage symptoms as they're going through cancer. We hear about those miracle stories, we hear about the successes, but we don't hear about all of the people who used cannabis to treat their cancer, that it hasn't helped. It hasn't made any difference in the world. So we just don't celebrate those ones. And then we get a little bit of a distorted view if we only hear about the good stories of it. So if somebody comes to you and says, I know cannabis is going to cure my cancer, that's all I want to use, please, you know, you do have a duty to advise that it's not a cure-all, doesn't cure all cancers. But again, another really useful tool in our toolbox to help in the treatment of cancer, specifically some of the symptoms that we get from cancer treatment or just the cancer itself. You can't get high from cannabis lotions or suppositories. You're going to read that in so many books, and it is just not true. You can absolutely get high from putting cannabis on your skin or using cannabis as a suppository. The absorption rate through the skin is actually quite high, and depending on the product and how vulnerable a person is to THC, you can definitely have some impairment happening from using both of those methods of treatment. Your sex size, weight, and your sex size and weight determine how you will be affected by THC. Again, it doesn't. It's more about genetics and the product that you're using and how you're using that product. So there's just a few. We could probably do a whole module just on cannabis myths, but that's just a few to look at. I think the most important one is that cannabis is not a cure-all. It's just another tool in our tool belt that we can use to help manage a lot of health conditions. How do you keep your cannabis safe? It's best to keep it in its original labeled container, just the same way you would keep any pharmaceutical drug. Somebody picking that bottle, they want to know what's in there so that you know, it isn't used inadvertently by someone who shouldn't be using it. Of course, we want to keep it always out of reach of young children. And maybe even out of sight of curious children that are maybe a little bit older, because children mimic what we do. So if they see, you know, you taking it every day and it's sitting on the same place on the cupboard, they may try it sometime. So again, lots of caution when children are in the household. Also, we want to store CBD and THC products in different areas depending on when you take them. So you don't mistakenly take your THC product when you should have taken your CBD product. So a lot of people take CBD first thing in the morning and then their THC at night. And I don't know how many people have come to me and told me that they took the wrong one. They took their THC in the morning and then that completely changed their day, because they're taking the THC to help them sleep and then they have to go into work. And so it can really kind of change the course of your day. So I always tell people, if they're doing that, you're doing your THC for sleep, your CBD during the morning, keep your CBD in the kitchen with your other supplements, your vitamin B, vitamin C, beside your coffee pot, and then keep your THC in the bathroom or beside your bed if there's no children around, and then that sort of reminds you when to take that product. You can get some really interesting lockable and smell-proof containers that are on the market now. Of course, these aren't just for cannabis, but they work quite well for cannabis. So if you do have, you're living in a communal household, people are coming and going, you're a little bit worried about somebody getting into your stash that shouldn't be getting into your stash, especially if it's children around, then this would be a good investment. And then, of course, that container, you'll probably want to keep it out of sight as well. These are also really good containers if you're traveling with your product, traveling on an airplane. Now you may have to open that up as you're going through security, so don't put the lock on until you're past the security at an airport. But it could be a good way to sort of just keep your product, first of all, from being taken from you, but also to protect it from people who shouldn't be using it inadvertently getting into your stash. And there's lots of really interesting products out in the market. You can go just do a Google search for lockable, smell-proof cannabis products. Edibles and safety, again, keep your store-bought ones in their original labeled container until ready to use. This is really important. Clearly label your homemade products. Keep them in a container that's a little more difficult to get into, and put a great big old label on there, especially if you're going to be storing it in the fridge where people are coming and going out of the fridge. If they see some nice homemade brownies in there, that, oh, what a great snack, but they're medicated brownies, you want to warn them about that so that they don't take it inadvertently and get into a really uncomfortable situation, especially if there's children around. Children see a cookie or a brownie, it looks really good. They see some gummies, they're used to having gummies as candy. So again, we got to keep that out of reach of children. Put a big warning label on it. Just say, hey, this contains some THC. It's medicine. It's not for your eating pleasure. And again, you want to keep these out of sight of children and teenagers just because they look really yummy and people might want to eat them if they're hungry. Again, children, can't stress this enough. Keep it out of reach of both children, young and older children. First of all, we don't want young kids getting into high amounts of THC or even CBD. We just don't know with the CBD high amounts with a young child if there could be some effects, but also with the THC, we don't want to see young children impaired or uncomfortable. But also, being irresponsible with our products around children just adds to that stigma that we're really trying to overcome with our cannabis products. So being responsible in the same way that you're responsible with your alcohol and with your other drugs that are in the household, if there are children around, really, we need to keep them out of sight, out of reach, so they don't get into them. Ingesting just even a little bit of dry herb for both adults and children can cause a lot of nausea and vomiting, and you may not know what's, like if you don't see the open package, you might not realize what they've gotten into. So, a couple of roaches in an ashtray that are sitting on a coffee table, a child can easily reach that, and just, a lot of children put everything into their mouth. That could be quite dangerous. Other devices as well, like if you use a bong, so a water bong or some sort of a pipe, that water in the water bong is medicated. It's not healthy for anybody to be drinking that, and it does have THC in it. And also pipes and stuff should be kept out of reach and out of sight of children. We also want to avoid smoking and vaping when there are young children in the room, just because especially secondhand smoke, same rules apply to secondhand cigarette smoke, secondhand cannabis smoke, somebody can become impaired from that. We also want to make sure with the vaping products, because we don't know, they're relatively new on the market, at least in the last 20 years or so, and so we don't really know the effects of secondhand vaping. Certainly it's a lot less than secondhand smoke, but it's still, we want to be cautious around that as well. Of course, pet safety, same thing that applies to small children can apply to pets. They can vomit if they drink bong water or eat some cannabis or have chocolate. So especially chocolate and cannabis that are combined. So medicated chocolate, chocolate is bad for dogs anyway, and then if that THC is in there, that could just kind of double the risk for them. And again, same rules apply with smoking and vaping. Just don't do it when your pets are around. It's just not fair to them. Okay, what about in the workplace? This is where you have to be really aware of what your workplace policies are on cannabis use, most especially if you are in a safety sensitive position. So if you're running equipment, if you're a driver, if you're in any kind of a position where impairment could endanger both yourself and your coworkers or the general public, then you cannot be using any kind of impairing product, which includes drugs, alcohol, and cannabis, THC cannabis. If you are in the medical system, so you have a medical authorization for use of cannabis, you have to think about the job that you do at work. So lots of people are prescribed painkillers that are impairing at work, and some companies do have that policy that you have to disclose your use of that to your HR department. Usually they keep that information confidential. At least we hope that they do. But it's really important to weigh the advantages and risks of disclosing cannabis use to your employer, or at least the HR department of your employer. If you do happen to have an accident, you're in a safety sensitive position, an accident happens and you're drug tested and they find THC metabolites in your blood, and you haven't disclosed that use, and you're a recreational user, you're not in the medical system, you don't have an authorization to use cannabis for medical use, you don't really have a leg to stand on. So it is really important that you sort of weigh your options there. If you are using cannabis for medical use and that it does involve THC, speak to a lawyer if that makes it more comfortable for you before you disclose it to your employer. But just know that that a lot of employers have a zero tolerance to any kind of impairment. If you are changing products or trying a new product that contains THC for the first time, always test it on your day off, right? You don't want to be testing a new product first thing in the morning and then going in to your safety sensitive position, not knowing how your body's going to react to that, right? So if you are using a new product, always test it on your day off so you can be confident on how your body's going to react to that. It's unlawful to do any smoking of cannabis anywhere, whether you're medical or not. That's just a rule that's in place. Impairment from cannabis will be treated the same as impairment from alcohol or any other drug. So it's really important that you understand your company's policy on drug use, and then what are the consequences of violating that policy. If your use of medical cannabis may impact the health and safety of you or someone else at work, then you have a legal obligation to ensure that it does not, right? So if you're having a bad day with your chronic pain and you really need to use some THC to deal with that, then you have to consider calling in sick or asking to not be in a safety sensitive position for that day. So again, the laws around here haven't been all that tested in the courts yet. That's likely going to come over the next 5, 10, 15 years. So it's a tricky area. I definitely do advise people, if they are using cannabis to manage a health condition, that at least get a medical authorization from a doctor, because then at least you have a little bit of a leg to stand on if something goes astray, if there's an accident that you're involved in. So again, tricky area right now. I'd say treat it the same as other drug and alcohol use in the workplace. The other thing in the workplace too is a lot of the CBD products on the market will have a small amount of THC in them. Won't be enough THC that you'll be impaired in any way. But that THC metabolites could show up in a urine test if you routinely have to be drug tested at work. So again, use caution around that. You got to be careful with it because it's a sad state of affairs when someone can have a glass of a couple of glasses of wine at dinner on a work night and then go in the next day and they're perfectly fine in a drug test. Maybe that alcohol won't show up. They can't get fired for that. Because metabolites of THC stay in the body for days, sometimes weeks, you can have, smoke your joint to relax after work in the same way that other people might have a glass of wine or a glass of beer or a drink. The next day you get a drug test. You're not impaired in any way, but they find metabolites of THC in that drug test, then you're considered impaired. So I know it's not fair and it's tricky, but those laws still have to be challenged in court, and it's going to take a few decades, if not, a few years, if not a few decades, to kind of solidify those real rules, have them challenged in court, and so that we can get some precedent on how employers and employees can manage using cannabis in the workplace. Public spaces, the laws regarding use of cannabis in public spaces is under the jurisdiction of the municipality. So it's not federal, it's not provincial, it's a city or municipality specific. So some small towns or smaller cities may not have any bylaws, and so then it's just be respectful. But other places, they do have very strict bylaws or very clearly defined bylaws of when and where cannabis can be used. So in Calgary, which is a city that I live in, cannabis can be consumed on private property, but it is prohibited to be used in any public place. So unless you own property in Calgary, you may find yourself with absolutely nowhere to use cannabis unless you go outside the city limits. So some people find that quite harsh. Other people like those rules. So again, as far as I know, this hasn't been challenged in court yet. That may be coming, but at this point in time, 2020, that's the rules. Cannabis use only on private property and not in any Calgary public spaces. There is an exemption for medical cannabis use, but city smoking bylaws do need to be followed. So if you are going to smoke or vape your cannabis, that has to be done in a designated smoking area. Again, this is another reason that if you are a person who uses cannabis on a daily basis, you may want to go get an authorization for medical use, because it does open up some space where you can be using your cannabis if you're not in your own private home. Now, again, you got to don't be ignorant about where you use your cannabis. We'll talk about that in a minute. So Calgary in particular, there's 3 areas that will enforce cannabis bylaws uses, or Calgary bylaws of cannabis use. Calgary Police, Community Peace Officers, and Calgary Transit Peace Officers. So other cities of a similar size may have similar rules and similar areas that those rules are enforced by. Violations are quite low for City of Calgary, $100 for a violation. So again, they're not really trying to make it super prohibitive. If more people kind of push that rule, they may up the fines of it if it becomes a nuisance. On the other hand, maybe in a few years, the powers that be will relax a little bit and say, hey, I guess it's okay as long as you're not smoking or vaping that could affect other people. So again, we're just in the beginning of this grand experiment of legal cannabis use. So lots of things to still kind of sort out as we go through, but be sure if you are traveling in other cities and towns within Calgary or even around the world, make sure that you check with the bylaws first, especially if you're someone who likes to use cannabis on a regular basis. if we keep violating those bylaws, again, that just adds to the stigma. So if cannabis users can be responsible in their use, follow the laws, and that will go a long ways to sort of having cannabis use accepted by the general public and law enforcement and lawmakers. Again, with public spaces, just be respectful when you are using it in public spaces, even though it's against the law. But that smoke can actually can blow for 2 or 3 blocks. If you've ever been in an area of a city where cannabis use is sort of kind of well known, you can often just walking down the street, you can smell cannabis being burned. You may not see where it's coming from, but you know, and some people don't mind that, and other people find it, you know, nauseating, or it might cause them a headache and stuff like that. So only smoke and vape in designated areas, and don't litter, right? Don't throw your roaches on the ground, or you know, just be courteous. Treat the public spaces the same way that you would treat your own personal space as well. Keep it clean. Keep it you know, keep it respectful in your cannabis use. Festivals and gatherings, again, a lot of festivals do have a zero tolerance to drug use, and that may or may not include cannabis. So again, before you buy your ticket to a big festival, especially if it's a multi-day festival that's outdoors, make sure you understand the rules that the festival has set up, and make sure you obey those rules, because again, we don't want to keep adding to that stigma of cannabis use, you know, that people who use cannabis are disrespectful. We want to sort of see if we can shed that stigma. If it's a private gathering, even just a neighborhood party on private property, again, check with the host or the person organizing the party and make sure that, you know, ask them how they feel about cannabis use at the party. Some might be totally fine with it. Some might be okay as long as you're not around the children. And some might say absolutely no, zero tolerance for any cannabis use on our property. So please respect the rules that are set up. Again, don't use cannabis in front of children. Only smoke and vape in designated smoking areas. And again, just don't litter. Like, be respectful with your cannabis use. High density living. This is actually more of a problem than some people realize, because in high density living, there is shared air that gets pushed around the apartment buildings through the ventilation system. And so if you are sitting in, you know, quietly in your own living room smoking a joint, 3 floors up or down the hall may end up smelling that product. And we need to be respectful. There are some people who are allergic to it. There's some people who it gives them headaches. There might be children living in those adjacent apartments as well. So it can travel through the venting system, so always be considerate of your neighbor. And there's actually a fairly rare condition, but it is, there's people out there that are, they get both asthma attacks from smelling cannabis smoke, but they can also become anaphylactic. So they can go into anaphylactic shock from the smell of cannabis. So again, it's rare, but just if somebody comes up to you and says like, hey, I'm anaphylactic from cannabis use, please don't do that, then you know that they're not lying. It is an actual condition. It's, like I say, it's rare, but it does exist. Your landlord can restrict your use of cannabis within your rented apartment or condo. Your condominium bylaws could restrict the use of cannabis within your condominium space. So again, before you rent or before you buy a condo, make sure that you check out the bylaws, check out the rental agreement. If you are a cannabis user and your rental agreement or your bylaws in your condominium don't specifically have rules around cannabis, ask for written clarification around that, just so that you know the rules, so that somebody doesn't say, hey, you're not supposed to smoke cannabis, I'm going to kick you out or fine you. And you say, well, nobody ever told me that, right? It wasn't in the rental agreement. So make sure that if you are a cannabis user, make sure that that is explicitly written down in your rental agreement, just to protect both you and the landlord in the future. So restrictions may just cover just smoking or vaping. So anything that might get into the air, and it's okay to use non-smoking methods of using cannabis, or it might just apply to growing cannabis plants within your apartment or your condo, or it might be all of the above. Also remember, if you are living in a condo and you like to bake with cannabis, that's really smelly, right? That's can be even smellier, create a lot more odor than even just smoking the cannabis itself. So if you are cooking, you like to cook with cannabis, and you do live in an apartment building, you may want to find a friend's house where you can do that cooking so that you're not bothering other people within the condo. Okay, travel protocols. Neither medical nor recreational retail cannabis can be taken out of Canada. You can't cross international borders with this product. Doesn't matter if it's medically authorized. It doesn't matter if it's just CBD with no THC in there. 2020, right now, as we're creating this, you cannot take your cannabis products across international borders. In order to do that, you need an export license, and nobody's going to give you an export license to take a couple of bottles. At least it'd be a lot of hassle to go through. On the same token, if you are in a country where cannabis products are legal, you can't bring those back into Canada. If you travel out of the country, buy something, say when you're down in the States or over in Europe, if you buy something, you can't bring that back into Canada. Again, that requires an import license. Now, there is a small caveat around here, because I have known a couple of people who have been able to get exemptions to take their medical cannabis out of the country and then take it into their country that they're going to. This needs to be planned out months in advance, because there's a lot of paperwork. It needs to go through a lot of different areas. So first of all, you have to get permission from the Canadian federal government to take that product out of the country. And then you need to have permission to take that product into the country where you're going to. And you'll also, if you have a stopover flight somewhere in another country, you'll also need an exemption in order to transport your cannabis through that country. It's a lot of work. I've seen it. I've seen two people able to kind of go through all the paperwork. One was a woman who wanted to take her medical cannabis into Italy because she was going on a 6-month stay there to visit family. She got permission from Canada. She got permission from Italy. And that took her months. I think it took her like 5 or 6 months to get all that paperwork in place. And then she suddenly realized that she was going through Germany. On her trip, she had a layover at an airport in Germany, and she just ran out of time to get permission from the German consulate in order to transport her product through there. So it can be done. It's a heck of a lot of paperwork, and please plan well in advance. The fines are hefty, which could include you being barred from entry into the country that you're trying to take the product into. You could be charged with trying to export a cannabis product outside of Canada. So it's not something that I suggest you play around with. Australia is the other example that I saw where a fellow was going down to Australia for work, and he was able to get permission both from Canada to take his CBD only products out of Canada, and he got permission from the Australian government to bring those products with him while he worked down in Australia. So again, it's not impossible, but it requires a lot of pre-planning, a lot of paperwork, a lot of phone calls, a lot of emails, a lot of putting things into place. I'm assuming as cannabis becomes more acceptable and more countries sort of open up to legalizing cannabis, or at least regulating cannabis, that's going to get easier to, just the way we can carry other drugs back and forth across the borders. But at this point in time, 2020, it's a difficult thing to do, and there are hefty fines associated with that. Okay, so that's traveling outside the country, but you can carry your legally obtained cannabis within Canada's borders across provincial borders. So planes, trains, automobiles, buses, you can carry your product on there. You might want to put it in one of those smell-proof containers that we were talking about earlier, just so that people don't get curious if they're smelling your product if you're on a bus or an airplane. The airlines do ask that you keep it in your carry-on luggage. Any liquid cannabis products you just keep in your little baggie with your other liquids. That's how you do it that way. When you're traveling by car, just know the rules within that province. Every province has a slightly different rule, and usually they're the same as transporting alcohol. So a lot of times that just means that the alcohol and the cannabis has to be out of reach of both the driver and everybody else in the car, in the vehicle. So that usually means keeping it in usually in the trunk of the car is the best place to transport that. Illicit use. So don't resell your cannabis that you've purchased. If you grow cannabis, don't sell it to your friends. Now you can gift it to your friends or gift it to a family member, small amounts, but you can't resell it. Never provide cannabis to underage children. So even a 17-and-a-half-year-old in Alberta would be considered underage. If you are smoking a joint in a circle, which is a social thing that a lot of people do, pass a few joints around in a circle. If there is, in Alberta, if there's a 17-year-old, if they're the day away from their 18th birthday, they're still considered underage. And whoever passes that joint to them could be charged with supplying cannabis to a minor. Now, I've never heard of that before, but technically that is the law. So I wouldn't push that at all. So make sure that if you are in a cannabis use circle where there's joints being passed around, make sure that you know the age of the person beside you, so that you're not inadvertently caught doing that. The fines for providing cannabis to underage children are hefty, and they will vary by province to province and territory. Also, if you're a recreational user at this point in time, you can only carry up to 30 grams on your person. And that's of your recreational. If you are medically authorized to use cannabis, then it's your monthly allotment. So if your daily allotment is 2 grams a day, then you go 2 times 30, you can carry 60 grams with you. Now, how does all of this apply for your homegrown product? Tricky, because we don't really have a container that is specifically for homegrown cannabis products. We like to, make sure that it's really well labeled, that it's a small amount, it has a childproof container on it. So all of the rules that you would use for how to transport your legally obtained product. You can still legally transport your homegrown product, but it's a little bit harder to identify that if you don't have the proper packaging to go with it. So again, lots of gray areas that we're still going to sort out over the next few years. And finally, let's just talk about common courtesy, right? Cannabis has just suffered from this disinformation campaign for almost 100 years now. Let's not add to the stigma, right? Always use cannabis responsibly and make sure that you know the rules, you're following the rules, and maybe we can kind of help to give cannabis a new lease on life so that everybody can benefit from it, rather than it sort of undergoing another 20, 50 years of stigmatization. So that's our safety precautions and social awareness.